Welcome to the Clearground Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. So we've got a bunch of news for you guys today as usual. We're going to start off with a few stories that are not related to COVID in any way, and they're going to be pretty interesting. We're going to talk about Texas and their new semiconductor factory they're planning to build in conjunction with Samsung. Then we're going to talk a little bit about CO2, a blizzard in Hawaii, these new suicide pods in Switzerland, and much more. Then on COVID front, we're going to discuss new mandates and regulations, both in the US and abroad. We're going to talk about definitions, especially in relation to the anti-vax definition. Then we're going to go over some heart disease statements in the UK, as well as what the Pfizer chief medical officer has to say on the particular drug from Pfizer. Then we'll look a little bit at the CMS public statement, as well as what the talking heads in The View have to say. All that and much, much more, so let's dive on in. Our first story of the day is brought to you by Fox Business, and the title of the story is Texas will be the home of semiconductor manufacturing amid chip shortage, according to Governor Greg Abbott. The governor of Texas touted the move during a news conference as, quote, the largest foreign direct investment in the state of Texas ever. The Samsung Electronics Device Solution Division Vice Chairman and CEO Dr. Kim said Samsung expects to create more than 2,000 high-tech jobs directly with the plant in Taylor and thousands more related to the plant once it's fully operational. The article goes on by saying the chip-making factory coming to Taylor will also be the largest investment made by Samsung in the U.S., the company said in a news release, bringing the firm's total investment in the U.S. to more than $47 billion since beginning operations in the country in 1978. The article ends with a quote from Greg Abbott, and I'm going to quote it for you right now. The country made a mistake over the past 1 or 2 decades to farm out manufacturing of all these essential supplies, whether it be now semiconductors or it could be healthcare supplies that we needed during the time of COVID. Whatever the case may be, we need to not depend upon China or other countries for our essential needs, for things like semiconductors. From semiconductors to global CO2 emissions. According to this article on Carbon Brief, global CO2 emissions have been flat for a decade, new data reveals. So this is a relatively long document. It's linked below in the description, and so you guys should feel free to dive in. There's a bunch of information here. I'm just going to go over a few brief notes from it that I thought were pretty interesting. So for starters, the Global Carbon Project projects that fossil emissions in 2021 will reach 36.4 billion tons of CO2, only 0.8% below the pre-pandemic high of 36.7 in 2019. So while fossil emissions are expected to return to near record levels, the study also reassesses historical emissions from land use change, revealing that global CO2 output overall may have been effectively flat for the past decade. So these changes come from an update to underlying land use datasets that lowered the estimates of cropland expansion, particularly in tropical regions. Emissions from land use change in the new GCP datasets have been decreasing by around 4% per year over the past decade, compared to an increase of 1.8% per year in the prior version. However, the GCP authors caution that uncertainties in land use change emission remain large, so this trend remains to be confirmed. So the new updates to global CO2 emissions in the GCP substantially revise scientists' understanding of global emission trajectories over the past decade. The new data shows that global CO2 emissions have been flat, if not slightly declining, over the past 10 years. However, falling land use emissions have counterbalanced rising fuel CO2 emissions, and there is no guarantee that these trends will continue in the future. The GCP has always reported on emissions from both fossil CO2 and from land use change. Fossil CO2 emissions represent upwards of 90% of current global emissions and understandably tend to get most of the attention. However, the GCP researchers have long pointed out that the largest uncertainties in understanding of CO2 emissions comes from the LUCs, land use change, despite its relatively small contribution to the total. So this chart right here shows global CO2 emissions from both fossil and LUC. The dashed light blue lines shows the prior GCP estimate of global CO2, while the solid dark blue shows the new estimate. The shaded area represents the combined uncertainty from both land use and fossil CO2 emissions in the new GCP estimate. So previously, the GCP data showed global CO2 emissions increasing by an average of 1.4 gigatons of CO2 per year between 2011 and 2019, prior to COVID-related emissions declines. The new revised data sets show that global CO2 emissions were essentially flat, increasing by only 0.1 gigatons of CO2 per year from 2011 and 2019. When 2020 and 2021 are included, the new GCP data actually shows slightly declining global emissions over the past decade, though this should be treated with caution due to the temporary nature of COVID-related declines. This following chart shows global CO2 emissions from land use. So this is what we were just talking about. Now, the revision in global CO2 emissions is almost entirely due to the revised land use emissions. I'll close out with a few statements from their global carbon budget, but this is a really great paper, and again, I recommend everybody go and check it out if they're interested. So noteworthy standouts in the carbon budget. China and India have both surpassed their 2019 emission peaks in 2021. China's emissions grew by 5.5% between 2019 and 2021, while Indian emissions grew by 4.4%. Chinese coal use was a particularly large driver of the global rebound in emissions, with the power and industry sectors in China the main contributors. Coal, oil, and gas all fell during the pandemic, but both coal and gas emissions have already surpassed their pre-pandemic levels, with a 2% increase in gas emissions and a 1% increase in coal emissions between 2019 and 2021. Oil emissions also remain around 6% below 2019 levels, and this persistent reduction is one of the main reasons 2021 emissions did not see a new record. Now, not to intentionally open a big can of worms here, because I'm not going to go into it, I'm just going to say that I don't think CO2 is really the only metric we should be looking at, and I definitely don't think it's the most important metric to be looking at, but I will report on it because it's what's popular and people like to know about it. And now moving on to our next story, a blizzard in Hawaii. So this is coming from the New York Post. Blizzard warning in effect for Hawaii, 8 inches of snow to be expected. So there's a blizzard warning, and it's in effect for Hawaii's Big Island mountain summit, with forecasters warning that up to 8 inches of snow are possible this Sunday. In addition to those 8 inches of snow potentially being dumped on the region, there also may be winds up to 125 miles per hour. You know, the article mentions this, and I for one would not have expected it, but apparently blizzard warnings for Hawaii are rare, but not unheard of in this tropical destination. Yeah, I wouldn't have figured that, in tropical destinations, blizzards were rare. The last blizzard warning was issued by the National Weather Service in Hawaii, and it was more than 3.5 years ago. Also important to note that the Big Island summit reaches nearly 14,000 feet, so that's pretty high up there. The next article comes from Disclosed TV. 3D printed suicide pods are now legal in Switzerland. So according to the article, there is a 3D printed capsule, and it's set to revolutionize assisted suicide. So in 2020, around 1,300 people died in Switzerland through euthanasia. They were cared for by the two largest euthanasia organizations in the country, Exit and Dignitas. The current common method is the ingestion of liquid sodium pentobarbital. After taking the drug, the person falls asleep within 2 to 5 minutes before slipping into a deep coma and dying soon after. Now here's a picture of the 3D printed capsule, what it might look like. And here's the thing, it can be activated from inside by the person who wants to die. The machine can be taken any place to die. So they're kind of advertising at this point that it could be in an idyllic outdoor setting, which is really creepy. But the way that the capsule works in terms of actually killing the person is that it floods the interior compartment, the chamber, with nitrogen, which very quickly reduces the oxygen content from 21 to 1%. So the death in this case occurs from hypoxia and hypocapnia, which is lack of oxygen and carbon dioxide respectively. So according to Nitschke, there is no panic, no feeling of suffocation. Now the language he uses is kind of creepy when he's suggesting, hey, look, it's peaceful, it's easy, there's no problem. It's creepy because it almost makes it seem okay. Some people will inevitably use this technology, but I don't think it's something that should be actually celebrated or rejoiced about by a country or talked about in such calm and easy terms. Societies that tend to make death seem sweet and kind and almost something to look forward to, I think will tend to be societies that see more death. Now, don't get me wrong, of course, no one makes that if you're alive. It's just that when you make things like this legal and sort of attractive, I think some of the clientele might be people that are depressed or anxious or looking for a way out that, with other interventions will end up living a very long life, but now that this is available, may end up abusing this system. So we'll see what happens. This is some interesting scientific news, and it is now legal in Switzerland, I believe. So on to COVID news. Let's hear what Bill de Blasio has to say first.
We've got Omicron as a new factor. We've got the colder weather, which is going to really create additional challenges with the Delta variant. We've got holiday gatherings. We in New York City have decided to use a preemptive strike to really do something bold to stop the further growth of COVID and the dangers it's causing to all of us. So as of today, we're going to announce a first-in-the-nation measure. Our health commissioner will announce a vaccine mandate for private sector employers across the board. all private sector employers in New York City will be covered by this vaccine mandate as of December 27th. We're going to have some other measures as well to really focus on maximizing vaccination quickly so we can get ahead of Omicron and all the other challenges we're facing right now with COVID.
So you guys know my position on this. I think this is a terrible decision. And I mean, de Blasio is not doing himself any favors. As of October, his approval rating was 25 to 56%. That means he was a net 31 points negative. So he's not popular with New Yorkers. He's leaving in disgrace, and I think this is not the right move. Also, I think this is going to really impact the New Year's Eve party. De Blasio does seem to have this fascination with ruining just about everything. But a couple more details on the mandate. This comes from the New York Times. Under New York City's new mandate for private employers, employees who work in person at private companies must have one dose of the vaccine by December 27th. Remote workers will not be required to get the vaccine. There is no testing option as an alternative. So towards the end of that clip with de Blasio talking, they had other things posted on the mandate. We'll go over those right now. This is from CNN. So children's ages 5 to 11 in New York will now also be required to show proof of at least one shot before being allowed access to indoor dining, fitness, or entertainment, the mayor just said. Adults will now be required to show proof of 2 vaccinations for these areas. It's always a good plan to isolate children from society and culture, especially when there's a disease out there that really statistically does not impact children. This was just a terrible decision. Now, there is some solace in the fact that de Blasio is terrible at implementing things, so this might not be implemented that well. That'd be great. This is also an important milestone because it shows once again that America is not isolated. Things that happen around the world can also happen here, and it just so happens that it's happening in New York right now. Speaking of new laws, now let's talk about the new Austria law coming in place, and this comes from the KNEWS news website. The title is, Austria will fine the unvaccinated €600 every 3 months from February 1st, 2022. So a fine of up to €600 every 3 months will be imposed on those who are not vaccinated against COVID-19 starting February 1st, according to a draft law prepared by the Austrian government. Exceptions, according to the Austrian public television, will be provided to those under 14 years of age, pregnant, or recovering from COVID-19 up to 6 months after a positive test, and those who could not be vaccinated for health reasons. Now, the fines can reach up to €3,600 per dose of vaccine should the person make an appointment but not show up. I really hope they're not using cases as a metric because this is not going to end well for that. Now, in another interesting piece of news, I looked this up on Sunday yesterday, and then I saved the picture, and you can look it up today. It's the same. Merriam-Webster added the word anti-vaxxer to their dictionary, or I don't know if they added it or how long it's been here, but the definition seems to be very recent because it says this. Definition of anti-vaxxer: a person who opposes the use of vaccines or regulations mandating vaccination. They are literally defining into existence new categories of anti-vaxxers. I guarantee you there are a bunch of people that have been vaccinated that are also against mandating this vaccination. This is just so scary to me because, for example, how badly do you need people to affirm what you're saying that you need to change a definition? You can't convince them any other way but forcing them to either get the vaccine or literally change the definition of words so that they're excluded until they become in your included category by doing what it is you tell them to do. Now, not only does misery love company, but so does stupidity. So let's listen to what The View has to say on the unvaccinated and Omicron.
Yeah. Well, they don't agree with that. They feel that their greater good is more important than your greater good.
Well, it was interesting to me that the argument was being made, if you're vaccinated, why do you care about me being vaccinated? You're protected. And that's why we are at the Omicron variant, right? That's why we are where we are, because it's mutating. It's becoming this crazy superbug inside of the people that aren't vaccinated. And now it's affecting us. I don't know why they were not understanding that. We've got like 80 million people that are not vaccinated.
They understand. They don't want to.
Yeah.
Period.
We all
Choice,
understand.
I guess.
But we all understand that when it comes to, for example, secondhand smoking, right?
Yeah.
I don't smoke, and I don't want you to smoke next to me because I don't want to swallow your.
So how Joy Behar starts off here by saying they don't believe that. They believe that their greater good is more important than your greater good. she is literally imposing her greater good over someone else's greater good. So she's using the argument that she's telling people, or she's accusing others of using. So I don't know if that makes that argument acceptable because she's using it, or if she just doesn't realize that she's doing exactly what she's accusing others of doing. Now, moving on to Sunny's point. So I'm not even sure how this isn't considered misinformation. I mean, it is misinformation in the technical sense of the term, but obviously it's not getting flagged anywhere. So what's interesting here is a few things. So number one, she is blaming the unvaccinated. So she's saying, look, because you filthy unvaccinated people are walking around without the boosters or the vaccines, you're allowing this virus to mutate deep inside of you, and then it's infecting us. Now, I have no idea where she's getting that data or that information, but the original people that were discovered to have Omicron a couple of weeks ago in Botswana all were vaccinated. Now, when looking at the genome sequence like we did a couple of weeks ago of Omicron, remember, it has 10 different mutations in the spike protein. Delta only had 2. The vaccine, the mRNA vaccines at the very least, target specific spike proteins. So it kind of makes sense that if there's a variant out there that has many, many mutations to the spike protein, it would impact vaccinated people similarly to unvaccinated people. Now, what's also interesting is that the only reason to select for these mutations, at least one of the main obvious reasons that a virus might select, and when I say select, of course, it's nature helping select, it's not like the virus is choosing this, but the only reason that it would be selected to do this, or the pressure that comes for selecting this, is the fact that the vaccines are active for certain spike proteins. So if a virus mutates successfully to have a different spike protein configuration that allows it to get past these vaccines, well, that seems to be something that a virus might do. And it might only do that because of the pressure from the vaccinated, right? It's not like it goes into an unvaccinated person and says, well, I need to change things up because I can't get past their immune system. No, they can. It's in the vaccinated person that the virus has to change the way that it attacks. This is conjecture, of course, because the Omicron is so early. I mean, we can't know much about it, but there's lots of evidence showing that viruses can adapt this kind of behavior. And one final point before moving on to Ana Navarro is that both influenzas and coronaviruses are extremely notoriously hard to snuff out, which is why we haven't done it. They are excellent at mutating. They typically don't have a high fatality rate, and they can transmit very easily. And so there's always circulation of these viruses around the world. Think of flu seasons. COVID is going to be the same way. Now, finally, on to Ana Navarro's point, who cares about smoking? I mean, I guess her point is that she doesn't like it when others smoke, so it was good to ban smoking so she wouldn't have to breathe in other people's smoke. But what does that have anything to do with COVID? I have no idea, except that in both cases you're breathing. It's good to know that we can always rely on The View to give us the education we need to combat the misinformation out there. So slightly dovetailing off of The View, we have news from BBC that came out that I don't understand why the BBC reported on this, but Belgian zoo hippos test positive for COVID. So a Belgian zoo has said that its 2 hippopotamuses have been taken into quarantine after testing positive for coronavirus. It is unclear how Imani, age 14, and Hermine, age 41, caught the virus in the Antwerp Zoo. The animals are doing well, apart from having a runny nose. I wonder, never mind. Restrictions have been tightened at the zoo until the animals test negative. So here we go. The hippos' noses are usually wet, but vets at Antwerp Zoo decided to test the pair after they noticed they were expelling snot. So their enclosure has been sealed off. The handlers who have tested negative must wear masks and safety glasses and disinfected footwear before any contact with the hippos. Well, we certainly don't want to take any chances. Might as well just vax them up, wait 2 weeks, see how they're doing. Moving on to some real news. According to the UK standard, up to 300,000 people facing heart-related illnesses due to post-pandemic stress disorder, warns physician. So here we go into the article. Up to 300,000 people in the UK are facing heart-related illnesses due to post-pandemic stress disorder, PTSD, 2 London physicians have warned. This could result in a 4.5% rise in cardiovascular cases nationally because of the effects of PTSD, with those aged between 30 to 45 most at risk, they claim. So Mark Rayner, who's a former senior NHS psychological therapist, said that as many as 3 million people in Britain are already suffering from PTSD thanks to stress and anxiety caused by the effects of COVID-19. He fears this could result in dramatic rises in physical health issues, such as coronary heart failure if cases are not detected or treated early. Now, he warns, and of course he does, that without at least doubling the current funding for the NHS, they're not going to be able to tackle this trauma time bomb, which could have potentially fatal consequences for those suffering with long-term PTSD. Meanwhile, Tahir Hussain, who's a senior vascular surgeon at the Northwick Park Hospital in Harrow, said he has seen a significant rise in cases where he works. Interesting. He said, "I've seen a big increase in thrombotic-related vascular conditions in my practice. Far younger patients are being admitted and requiring surgical and medical intervention than prior to the pandemic. I believe many of these cases are a direct result of the increased stress and anxiety levels caused from the effects of PTSD. We also have evidence that some patients have died at home from conditions such as pulmonary embolism and myocardial infarction. I believe this is related to many people self-isolating at home with no contact with the outside world and dying without getting the help they need. PTSD is a mental health condition induced by the pandemic. While it is not yet officially recognized, many experts believe it should be." It probably shouldn't be just yet. First of all, we're still in the pandemic. Second thing, how weird is it for the surgeon to be saying far younger patients are being admitted and requiring surgical and medical intervention than prior to the pandemic? Why is it far younger? How come that's the population? It can't possibly be that the far younger are so traumatically stressed from this, but no other age group is. Especially because the far younger generation has the most ability to connect around the world. You would think that maybe the older generations might be suffering more with their lack of understanding of technology, generally speaking, as compared to a younger population. But instead, it's these younger guys. And we've been talking all along with this show, months and months, about the particularly, it seems, negative impact in terms of cardiac health that this vaccine gives to younger males. There was, of course, no mention of that in this article. But interestingly, even the Pfizer chief medical officer acknowledges that, well, of course, not their vaccine, but other vaccines have been causing issues with people. Let's hear in.
Let me make it clear that when we're talking about the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, there have been no deaths have been reported to have occurred directly as a result of the vaccine and the vaccine alone. Okay? There have been deaths reported with other vaccines, and they're now beginning to look into the reasons for this. But I think that really needs to be clarified.
Now, I highly doubt that video is going to age well, and we have it here on the records when it doesn't. This is not to say don't get the vaccine. You guys already know my position on that. This is just to say that wouldn't it be great if they looked at all the factors that might contribute or lead to this instead of just naming some post-traumatic stress disorder on a pandemic that we're still in the middle of, to explain why the youngest of the population, why younger people in the population are suffering from heart issues that they wouldn't normally be suffering from. And finally, we're going to go over the new CMS memorandum. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services will not enforce the new rule regarding vaccination of healthcare workers or requirements for policies and procedures in certified Medicare/Medicaid providers and suppliers. This includes nursing facilities, hospitals, dialysis facilities, and all other provider types covered by the rule, while there are court-ordered injunctions in place prohibiting the enforcement of this provision. They make note about the Louisiana case that we discussed last week and how that impacted their decision-making. Now, for any doctors that listen to this that need this as a printout or something, the link is in the description below. And that's going to be all for us today, folks. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. I know it was a long episode. If you like this content, please share it with your friends and tell them to subscribe. When they subscribe, they can get the latest updates, as you guys know. I hope everybody has a great Tuesday. Please enjoy this video, and I'll be back on Wednesday tomorrow.
Oh, small fellow. No, you go straight on, mate. You go straight on. Doing a good job. That's a good well done. Good boy.